Good morning to everyone joining us here in person at Columbia University in sunny New York City, and good morning, good afternoon, or evening to everyone around the world joining us via live stream. My name is Radha Wickramasinghe. I am the Global Program Officer at Ford's Gender, Racial, and Ethnic Justice International Program, and I have the pleasure of serving as your moderator for today's event, titled Sexual and Reproductive Justice, Vehicle for Global Progress. This event follows the official launch of a November 22 report published by the High-Level Commission on the Nairobi Summit on ICPD 25 follow-up. The report, pictured behind me, is titled Sexual and Reproductive Justice as the Vehicle to Deliver the Nairobi Summit Commitments. I'm joined by three authors of the report, as well as a distinguished guest. So with no further ado, let's dive into some very brief introductions. First, I'm honored to welcome Dr. Natalia Kanem. Dr. Kanem has dedicated her life to improving the health and lives of women and children. She leverages her expertise in science, public health, and philanthropy to advance the reproductive health and rights of women and girls, and to uphold the human dignity of all. As UN Undersecretary General and Executive Director of UNFPA, the United Nations Sexual and Reproductive Health Agency, Dr. Kanem oversees its life-saving policy, development, and humanitarian work in over 120 countries. Next, I would like to welcome Terry McGovern, Professor and Chair of the Heilbronn Department of Population and Family Health and the Director of the Global Health, Justice, and Governance Program at Columbia's Mailman School of Public Health. Her research focuses on health and human rights, sexual and reproductive justice, gender justice, and environmental justice. Terry founded the HIV Law Project in 1989, where she successfully litigated numerous cases against the federal, state, and local governments. She later joined the Ford Foundation as Senior Program Officer in the Gender Rights and Equality Unit. She currently serves on the UNFPA Global Advisory Council and the UNAIDS Human Rights Reference Group. I would also like to welcome Malia Meyer, Senior Program Officer in the Columbia University Global Health, Justice, and Governance Program. Her research and advocacy portfolio focuses on sexual and reproductive rights, health rights and justice, and gender-based violence. Malia also conducts community-based participatory research to inform contraceptive service provision to adolescents. She has a decade of experience developing, implementing, and evaluating programs to improve the health and well-being of children, families, and communities. And joining us all the way from South Africa, it's my pleasure to welcome Nicolette Naylor, Pan-African feminist lawyer and senior philanthropic executive who has spent over 2 decades working at the intersection of justice, feminism, and philanthropy. She has led the Ford Foundation's Southern Africa office and international program on gender, racial, and ethnic justice. Her work has focused on increasing resources and financial support for civil society in the Global South and a commitment to strengthening the feminist funding ecosystem for Black and Indigenous feminist movements, as well as LGBTIQ+ and gender-expansive movements. So, with that, I'd like to begin today's discussions with remarks from Dr. Kanem. Dr. Kanem, can I invite you to the podium?
Thank you so much. Angela Davis says, you have to act as if it were possible to radically transform the world, and you have to do it every day. Thank you, Radha. Thanks also to Columbia University, Global Health, Justice, and Governance Program, Columbia World Projects, and the Ford Foundation. And I'm very happy to be here for UNFPA, the United Nations Sexual and Reproductive Health Agency, as a co-organizer and part of the mission for peace. Peace is the noble purpose of the United Nations, and that is what women want to see in the world today. And I'm really happy to say that I have walked the Liberation Road in sisterhood with Professor Terry McGovern, who's chair of the Heilbronn Department of Population and Family Health. And from our days as non-conforming colleagues at the Ford Foundation, working on reproductive rights and economic, social, and cultural rights. Here we are now, still focusing on population not as an issue of numbers, but of people, and still together advocating for reproductive justice. Terry, the United Nations is fortunate to have you provide lead authorship on the important Nairobi ICPD 25 Commission report we're discussing today, along with your co-authors, Malia and Nikki. Dear colleagues, dear scholars, greetings to Dean Ayman El-Mohandes. It's a pleasure for me to be back at Columbia University as a PNS graduate with mentors like Professor Nick Cunningham and Wafa El-Sadr and Leslie Davidson. And I have to say that during Black History Month, the quote from the incomparable Angela Davis sets out the mission, which is to radically transform the world towards equality, as in Sustainable Development Goal 5 on gender equality, and to do that all the time. And that's what sexual and reproductive health is all about. Radical transformation, and for us at UNFPA, it's about accelerating progress to a world where everyone can exercise autonomy over their own body. He, she, they enjoy full equality and fundamental rights, which is an entitlement. It is not charity to be bestowed from on high. Now, the International Conference on Population and Development, ICPD, took place in Cairo in 1994. At that time, nations unanimously established a global consensus that sexual and reproductive health and rights are a bedrock for growth and prosperity, for the individual and also for the society, and that Cairo ICPD platform of action spoke to women's rights. It spoke to the environment. This was the first time following on the 1992 Conference on Environment in Rio that sustainability was coming into discussion, a forerunner to the present-day SDGs. And Cairo then was followed in 1995 by the Beijing Women's Conference. Women's rights are human rights, and human rights are women's rights. And if the past 3 decades since then have shown us anything, it's that rights cannot be taken for granted. Yes, of course, there's progress. We can list fewer women dying during childbirth, more adolescents having access to contraception around the world, far more girls in school. However, let's admit that the pace of change is piecemeal and far too slow, and the movement still faces strong headwinds. COVID, conflict, climate-related disasters, the earthquake that we're facing now, Turkey and Syria in distress. These challenges mean hardship for millions of women and girls and others. And we see soaring hunger, poverty, widening inequalities, even in the midst of abundance. And of course, there's polarization in so many societies, and all of this is setting back progress. And this halting progress spells life and death for individual women and girls. And for women and girls of color, indigenous peoples, the LGBTI activist, someone with HIV, anyone living with a disability, marginalized for whatever reason, the risk of being pushed behind, as Radhika Balakrishnan puts it, is even greater. And these problems are human-made. So there are prospects of good solutions, and I back the proposition that human beings can change things radically. Why is progress so elusive? And what does UNFPA think that I, you, all of us should be out there doing in a world of 8 billion people? Upholding rights and choices matters more than ever, because at every major milestone of population growth, we see panic, we see inflammatory rhetoric warning that there are far too many people on planet Earth, in particular, those other people. And let's be clear, when politicians are talking about the problems with fertility rates or an ideal population size. It's a control issue, power and control. Any attempt to control another's body, whether by influence or by force. From policies, for example, some countries try to pay women as an inducement to have more children if population is shrinking. At other times, we see egregious violations and crimes like forced sterilization. Looking at population numbers in isolation invariably leads you to the wrong solution. Take climate change. People often simplistically blame countries with high population growth for damaging the environment. Yet the evidence is clear, and it shows that emissions are overwhelmingly attributable where? To the wealthiest countries, not those where the population growth is highest. And think about it, the woman in Niger, which at the moment has the highest fertility rate, average 7, she does not have a car. She does not have electricity. Finger pointing at her is missing the mark, which is oh so convenient for those of us who are indulging in conspicuous, thoughtless consumption. And what we do know is that societies that invest in people, in their rights, in their choices, and in young people in particular, they show us time and time again that that's the path to well-being, to prosperity, and to peace. So in celebrating 25 years since Cairo in 1994 at the Nairobi summit in the year 2019, in the face of huge pushback at that time, and continuing until now, against women's rights, we defeated the naysayers. We re-energized our movement for sexual and reproductive health, rights, and choices for all. And since that Nairobi summit, young people in particular have continued to raise their collective voice, to demand their rights, together with people with disabilities, indigenous peoples, people of African descent, and so many others. And that's heartening, because the world needs that energy. And we need their ideas, and we need their commitment to keep moving forward. Of course, what we say at the global level is important, but where it counts is on the ground, in countries and in communities. And accountability for implementing the Nairobi Summit's commitment is part of that key. When we look back to learn, that's good, but we have to keep looking ahead. The direction is ever more ahead. After that Nairobi ICPD 25 summit, I appointed a high-level commission of eminent persons, co-chaired by the former president of the United Republic of Tanzania, His Excellency Jakaya Kikwete, and the former Governor General of Canada, Madame Michaëlle Jean. And these commissioners lead an effort to keep that Nairobi summit commitment list, it's over 1,300 of them, and to keep the commitment makers who come from all facets of society, including the private sector, to keep them accountable. And I've been very curious to know if those pledgers were going to turn their words into action. And that's why this new Nairobi Commission report is so fascinating, because it boldly declares that sexual and reproductive justice, terminology introduced 30 years ago by Black feminists in this country, including people like Loretta Ross, that reproductive justice is the vehicle to deliver the Nairobi Summit SRHR commitments. And for us at UNFPA, we made commitments, and ours translate into 3 simple things that are huge in their simplicity, and it's on all of us to get the job done. The first, and we term them 3 zeros, because we want to see 0 unmet need for family planning. This is how we provide women and girls with the contraception that they say they want at a time when indeed world population is growing rapidly. But there's still stigma and hurdles to be able to walk sometimes long distances to the clinic, knock on that door and have someone be there who has choice in mind in terms of universal access. Right now, 1 in 5 countries have laws requiring women and young people to seek permission of a husband, of a parental figure, in order to access contraceptives. and there are more than 250 million women globally who have an unmet need for contraception. Our research has shown that half of all pregnancies in this world, 121 million pregnancies a year, are not intended. An unintended pregnancy is another signal of unmet rights and choices. Now, I am very adamant about the second zero, which is zero maternal mortality. When a mother dies during pregnancy or childbirth, it's a social justice disaster, and yet that's happening every 2 minutes around the world. Building a midwifery workforce is one answer so that women can get life-saving care near where they are, but access to contraception obviously is linked to this. Moreover, the research illuminates that we refuse to look at the issue of unsafe abortion, which is a big part of maternal death. And lastly, the zero gender-based violence zero. Zero means the end to violence and intimidation and up to femicide against women. Zero means a halt to exploitation of girls by marrying them off before the age of maturity. It means the end of genital mutilation. And there is no tradition, there is no culture, there is no excuse that can justify any of this. And after COVID, violence against women on the increase and femicide on the increase. So in all of these spheres, we aim to right these wrongs. And lately, with #BodyRight, we've been talking about technology-facilitated gender-based violence, which is yet another tool that is used to harass and silence women and girls, and that must end too. So when you think about it, a song or a movie or a corporate logo has more protections online than a human being. Why? #BodyRight, which is a campaign that we've launched with our partner Global Citizen, is calling on policymakers, on tech firms, on social media platforms to take action against bullying, against image-based abuse, and online misogyny. They move really quickly to protect copyright, and they can step in to protect body right. So please join this movement by signing the #BodyRight Global petition. Radical transformation. This is what we're looking for, and data must be deployed to help us identify and reach people who are most furthest behind. It's also important for us to keep making the investment case, which again is really clear. So apart from knowing the facts, we have to stand up and defend rights, because a recitation of the facts is not enough to change the reality. We have shown with our academic partners that every dollar invested in preventable maternal deaths and unmet need for family planning brings economic benefits, a range from $8.40, and this is through 2050. Powerful for the individual, but also for society. And now, next year, as we gear up to ICPD 30, the Nairobi Commission reports will be useful to identify our advocacy towards zero injustice. And I would like the world to open up and give that opportunity to every adolescent girl, to every young person, so they can flourish. And there is urgency in a world of 8 billion. Now, one side of the coin is countries with shrinking population. And here, I also advocate for women who would like to have a pregnancy, but cannot afford the astronomical costs of infertility treatments, and whose social situation, AKA childcare, AKA being shepherded by a midwife through pregnancy and in the aftermath, this opportunity is not available to them. When the United Nations convenes the Summit of the Future next year, I hope that population will be examined through the lens of social justice. In a world of 8 billion, we're not going to hang around and wait for 100 or 50 years for these zeros to be zeroed out. That's the radical transformation. And I'm just closing because the lives of girls hang in the balance with an appeal by a girl from Afghanistan that says it all. Can we show the short video, please?
I was at school, it was our last exam, and when our teacher said that Taliban came in Kabul, we really scared and we just escaped. The life of everyone in Afghanistan really changed. At the past, we went anywhere that we want, we wear anything that we want, but when they come, they get decision for us. We don't get decision for ourselves, and this just feeling like a slave. I thought that I cannot continue my life. I was really in a bad situation. It's not good that others get a decision for us. They get our decision, we should hide our face and not go to school. It's very bad. I miss all the things at school, my friends, my teacher, my books, and all my activities. I hope that they let girls to study because they really want to fulfill their dreams, to achieve their goals and stand on their feet. It's not time for us to get married very soon. We should just think about our bright future. My message to young girls is to not give up. It is okay to scare, it is okay to cry. Everything is okay, but giving up is not an option. After every dark night is a bright morning, and I wait for that bright morning.
Thank you for listening. I ask you to stand up for girls like Mursal, who depend on you. They depend on me to be able to protect and defend their reproductive rights, their right to education. And I joined the Nairobi ICPD 25 Commission in saying no exceptions, no exclusions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Kanem, for setting the stage for us, and particularly the radical transformation that we would like to see. I'd like to turn now to Nicolette. I think we're going to be joined by Nicolette. Hi, Nicolette. All the way from South Africa, very welcome. I'd like to turn to you. Can you define, in your own words, the concept of sexual and reproductive justice? What exactly is that framework, and how does it take us beyond existing debates and modes of operation, and what role does it play in breaking down silos across other justice agendas and concepts?
Thank you, Radha, and good morning, everyone. That's a great question, and before I get to answer, I just want to thank everyone for having me here today, albeit virtually from Cape Town. I'm really excited this important report to be part of a panel to discuss this, and a panel of dear comrades and friends. So thank you. It's great to be with all of you. To your question, I want to start with the history and why a reproductive justice lens matters, and then turn to some of the key principles. I think it's important to contextualize reproductive justice within a socio-political and a historical frame, because it was a response to a mainstream reproductive health movement that was invisibilizing large groups of women. And if you can indulge me for a minute, I want to take us back to 1994, when Black women, calling themselves the Women of African Descent for Reproductive Justice, first coined the term reproductive justice. And this was in recognition of the ways in which the mainstream reproductive rights movement was not representing Black, Indigenous, and women of color's lived experiences and needs. And this movement, with pioneers like Professor Loretta Ross, centered its work on the most marginalized communities and highlighted the experiences of those who had been rendered invisible. And they started to draw attention to how healthcare policies, even those that were being touted as expansive or progressive, were continuing to deny poor Black women access to vital reproductive health services. And they began to organize around the vast range of reproductive health needs within communities of color, from HIV/AIDS, maternal mortality, cervical and breast cancer. And their demands really drove home that reproductive health care had to be intersectional for it to be effective. They also traveled to 1994 ICPD conference, referenced already by Natalia, in Cairo, where there was also a critique of a global North feminist frame by women living in the global South. And this expanded this movement's own organizational language to include language grounded in a human rights framework. And so from 1997, it's critically important to point out that the collective work of the justice movement, the reproductive justice movement, expanded beyond the United States to other countries and geographies. And it needs to be seen within a global context and not only as a US collective. And this is thanks largely to the power of groups like Sister Song that harnessed this issue as a cross-border solidarity issue capable of being looked at beyond the US in order to speak to the needs of Black women, Indigenous women, and women of color around the world. So what were the critiques about the reproductive health movement's approach to the work, the mainstream approach to the work? And like I've highlighted, the first critique was that even policies that seemed progressive were rendering Black women and girls invisible and didn't meet their needs. And I think the further critique was that taking an individualistic approach to reproductive freedom and making it about protecting an individual's right to services like contraceptive services was a problem, because it reflected a set of assumptions around unfettered agency that applies only to a small group of often white women, often in the global North, who are privileged to have multiple choices in their lives. And thirdly, the reproductive justice movement specifically challenged the siloing of access to reproductive health services from other social justice issues, such as economic justice, racial justice, education, sexual orientation, gender identity, the environment. And for the last few decades, the reproductive justice approach has really emphasized the importance of looking at broader structural inequalities and how they impact on individuals' choice-making and decision-making. And so we have the primary tenets of a justice framework are the right to not have a child, the right to have a child, and the right to parent one's children in safe, sustainable environments, and also the human right to sexual autonomy and gender freedom. So those are the four main pillars and a bit of the history, which I thought was important. But let me just mention for me some of the principles that we must draw out of this for our work. Firstly, the idea of reproductive justice is inextricably linked to equality. It allows us to unpack the fault lines of inequality for different women, girls, gender non-conforming individuals. It also requires us to understand the multiple intersecting barriers that marginalized communities face. And this means that context matters. We must embrace an understanding of women and girls' reproductive autonomy within their particular and specific political, historical, and socioeconomic contexts. It's not about everyone's the same. And then a reproductive justice framework allows us to do a systematic analysis of the distribution of power and privilege that has regulated reproductive health policies. And this means that issues of race, gender, class, sexual orientation are central. They're not incidental, they're central to reproductive justice frameworks when we start to evaluate the barriers that are associated with reproductive rights. So whereas a health framework may have treated these issues as incidental, a justice framework requires us to treat this as central. The kind of change envisaged by a justice frame requires us to remove obstacles, oppressive systems, and conditions that make people vulnerable to violations, and to look more holistically and intersectionally at the issues that need to be addressed. And when we think of violations, we must also consider remedies, and it requires us to look and recognize the negative and positive obligations of the state to facilitate sexual and reproductive rights and develop the legal, social, and economic conditions, the enabling conditions for reproductive justice. And so in practice, this framework requires us to do a power analysis that looks beyond the health system, that also considers the education system, the criminal justice system, law enforcement, housing, child welfare. And that, I think, allows us to break down silos in our work, our research, our policy interventions, and our advocacy across issue areas. Because breaking silos requires us to acknowledge and overcome the cross-cutting, pervasive challenges that impact on reproductive health services. We cannot say, I work on sexual and reproductive health, but I don't look at issues of education or water or sanitation or violence or migration or labor exploitation. I think these are our blind spots, because to be effective in our work, we need to recognize, as Audre Lorde taught us, that women do not live single issue lives. And if we really want to have an impact, we have to grapple with the hard work around multiple structural issues and systems that are acting as barriers to reproductive health and justice. And we must organize ourselves in very different ways that doesn't split off and silo issues, even within feminist organizing spaces, that we're not siloing gender issues within gender. We're not siloing gender justice issues from racial justice issues and climate issues. And we have work to do here. Siloing of sexual and reproductive health from gender-based violence. And the last thing I'll say on this is that putting intersectionality and interlocking systems of oppression at the center of an analysis, it really focuses our attention on women, girls, gender non-conforming individuals that have been pushed to the margins of society. And it requires us to move their agendas to the center, because reproductive justice will only be achieved when all people have the social, political, and economic power and resources to make healthy decisions about their gender, their bodies, and their sexualities. I'll stop there. Thank you, Radha, and it's really nice to see you.
Thank you, Nicolette, for widening the lens, but also bringing it into much sharper focus for us. I'll turn now to you, Terry. Now that Nicolette has given us a framing, talk to us about how the sexual and reproductive justice framework can be applied to diverse contexts. In particular, how is it essential to achieving sustainable development and addressing humanitarian crises?
I'm going to go to the podium. Firstly, I actually want to thank the Commission for having the courage to do this report, and for Dr. Kanem for commissioning the report. I want to also really acknowledge Dr. Kanem's courage and persistence in fighting for sexual and reproductive justice consistently in her role at the UN. I also want to thank Dr. Wafa El-Sadar and Dr. Ayman El-Mohandes, who are here with us today. The Commission's work and this report is really a brave undertaking in today's world, a world in which politically motivated actors are dedicated to controlling bodily autonomy and reproductive capacity. As the prior speakers have noted, we live in a world in which humanitarian emergencies are increasing, climate crises are growing, and authoritarianism is on the rise. There is a reinvigoration of nationalism, often accompanied by homophobia, transphobia, increasing inequity, and an overall anti-feminist climate. What I like about this report is we are interested in transformative change, the details of transformative change. Governments have made multiple international commitments to finance and promote sexual and reproductive health, gender equality, women's empowerment. This report begins to parse out how they may achieve these commitments in a comprehensive manner by recognizing and utilizing a sexual and reproductive justice framework. The commissioners are calling on countries to craft and fund an approach addressing economic, social, and legal barriers and obstacles caused by all of these multiple intersecting forms of discriminations. This is also central to UNFPA's strategic plan. There are some obvious gaps in global governance of access to sexual and reproductive health services and justice. Data, we've made a lot of progress. It's currently disaggregated by sex, age, wealth, urban, rural, level of education, but there are other important axes of discrimination: race and ethnicity, migratory status, disability and sexual orientation, gender identity, disability status. We're not capturing those details. Data is currently, data on the aggregate impact of intersecting forces helps us identify and scale up cost-effective solutions, like deploying more midwives. Better data would help us reshape research, inform policies and program, and analyze global health architecture with an eye towards leadership and power of the most excluded, gender-expansive, people with disabilities, indigenous, racial, and ethnic minorities. Overall, the report points out we sorely lack accountability mechanisms, especially ones that capture whether or not governments in implementing regional or international commitments have adequately addressed these intersecting forms of oppression. True accountability requires interrogating international financing, development policy, trade policy, private capital flow, and overseas development assistance. It requires looking upstream to the structural factors that result in the same groups being overlooked again and again, the same services being underfunded, the same discriminatory laws and policies persisting. On funding, one example, we have seen in our research tracing bilateral and multilateral commitments to finance prevention and treatment of gender-based violence that unless the funding is specifically earmarked for gender-based violence in emergency relief disbursements like COVID, it doesn't go where it's supposed to go. We see it lost in the disbursement process. Funds are shifted elsewhere. We've seen that GBV organizations, gender-based violence organizations, foist into crisis are held to the same strict reporting standards as before the crisis. And what happens? Invariably, it's the services to the most vulnerable, hard-to-reach populations that fall off. The SRJ framework asks us to fix this. Let's look at these structural barriers and fix them. The need is particularly acute in humanitarian, fragile state or conflict settings. We know that humanitarian crisis reduces access to abortion, antenatal care, family planning, SRH services, mental health services. We see deficient health systems, a shortage of skilled health providers, supply stockouts, restrictive policies. There are problems with gender norms in dominant cultures, a lack of infrastructure, inadequate emergency obstetrician and newborn care. There is inadequate clinical management of rape across the board. As a result, we see increased unintended pregnancy, unsafe abortion, pregnancy complications, and the whole lot. Over half of all maternal deaths occur in humanitarian and fragile settings, as do 53% of deaths of children under 5 and 45% of neonatal deaths globally. Safe abortion is not available across settings, and this is the cost. Unsafe abortion causes from 25% to 50% of maternal deaths in refugee settings. There's inadequate attention to male survivors of sexual violence, sex workers, people with disabilities. We see that many of the policies are tailored towards heterosexual, cisgender women of reproductive age. We see application of local discriminatory laws rather than internationally accepted standards, which enables discrimination against adolescents, women, LGBTQI populations. Third-party consent requirements, as Dr. Kinem mentioned, a male relative, a husband, parents, block access for many women and girls. Or there are marriage requirements for access. We know that in many settings, health protection actors deprioritize sexual and reproductive health. There is political resistance. There are leadership and coordination challenges, inconsistent monitoring, scarce research. There's a tendency to prioritize the restoration of political order and physical rebuilding while neglecting gender-based violence and sexual and reproductive health. We've seen the need to respond to GBV in humanitarian settings increase by 120% over the last 2 years, only 20% of the response is funded. Analysis of funding distribution confirms that SRH services is a tiny part of overseas development assistance to conflict-affected countries. And most of the funding is going to very narrow services, not the services foreseen by the sexual and reproductive justice framework. This framework forces us to look at the loss of bodily autonomy many women and girls face in conflict. There's so many examples in the report where Yugoslavia detained women were raped and forcibly impregnated to ensure they would give birth to the perpetrator's children, ethnic cleansing, eastern region of the DRC, systematic sexual violence, the Russian Federation deeming childless people anti-Russian in the context of the military incursion in Ukraine. There have been millions of women affected in Ukraine, often having to flee to Poland, where abortion is very difficult to access, sexual violence is rampant, gang rape, coercion. There are just huge barriers all over the place. WHO has confirmed over 500 attacks on healthcare facilities, and of course, persons with disabilities lack access to bomb shelters, evacuation trains, long-term care facilities lack food, medication, hygiene. There have been massive attacks on perinatal, maternity, and children's hospitals. There is no mystery to these patterns. This is what this framework tells us. They reoccur throughout the world. But the sexual and reproductive justice framework asks governments, development, humanitarian actors, and donors to finally, once and for all, anticipate and address these profound consequences. There are massive, multiple intersecting harms. National and international humanitarian actors, development organizations, governments, donors must evaluate, are you truly anticipating and addressing what we all know happens over and over and over again? This framework identifies the need to dismantle these unequal patterns of resource distribution and power and ask, are we truly and adequately prioritizing the leadership of not just local groups, but leadership from the most marginalized? Are you working with populations to be sure that they understand how to infiltrate leadership structures? The report actually identifies, however, some points of light, and that's where I'll end. Truth and reparations processes have actually begun to require corrective action to disrupt the normalization of violence and conflict, very much in line with the sexual and reproductive justice framework. In 2019, the Colombia Constitutional Court addressed forced abortion and forced contraception by the Revolutionary Armed Forces and held that this is gender-based violence. There is an obligation to provide victims with immediate, comprehensive, and specialized assistance to recover from physical and psychological harm. The court required reparations for reproductive coercion. This is a huge step forward. In 2021, the International Criminal Court convicted a Ugandan Lord's Resistance Army commander of forced impregnation of women and girls. And the decision explored the devastating consequences beyond the act of rape. Mothers and children experiencing stigma and challenges reintegrating communities, rejected because of perceived affiliation with the rapist. Children viewed as enemies, falling outside social and economic kinship structures, affecting their economic security, access to health, education, employment. Norms give women sole responsibility for children and hinder their ability to access education, their professional ambitions, their livelihoods. The sexual and reproductive justice lens requires a contextual analysis where the harm is not just the rape, it's all of it. In 2021, the ICC recognized this, distinguishing forced pregnancy from other forms of sexual and gender-based violence, partially on the basis of its distinctive element of the deprivation of women's reproductive authority and right to life, in a sense. The court acknowledged that forced pregnancy impacts are broader than sexual violence or physical harm. There is a loss of decision-making, power over one's reproductive capacity, and these harms each require independent recognition. This is not a health issue or just a single act of violence. There are profound intersectional impacts. So we know that women are vital to peace and security. This link also must be acknowledged. In short, this framework requires a comprehensive response that addresses structural barriers, discriminatory laws and policies, inadequate funding caused by failure or deprioritization for the most vulnerable. The framework sees the answer partially in the empowerment and leadership of those directly affected and most marginalized. We thank the Commission and Dr. Kinem for affording us the opportunity to work on this important report. We see this report and the Commission's acts as really a roadmap to finally, once and for all, actually addressing women and girls where they're at. So thank you.
Thank you, Terry. Thank you for bringing that sense of urgency and the focus on humanitarian settings, which is so important today. I'd like to turn to Malia. Could you tell us a little bit about how sexual and reproductive justice has contributed to progress in realizing the Nairobi commitments so far? And what are some emerging good practices we've seen at country and regional level?
I will try to be brief as I know we're running out of time, but I also just want to echo Terry's gratitude to thank Dr. Kinem, UNFPA, and the High Level Commission for just entrusting us with this collaboration. So as Dr. Kinem noted earlier, over 1,300 commitments were made at the Nairobi Summit in 2019. And when we look at the nature of those commitments, we see a high number prioritizing sexual and gender-based violence. And we also importantly see that all regions made commitments that included data. These, of course, varied in scope, but generally included things like the implementation of countrywide censuses, the need for data disaggregation, and the use of data to inform policy and practice. Another aspect worth noting is that numerous country-level commitments align with the sexual and reproductive justice framework by explicitly paying attention to historically marginalized populations. So how, if at all, have these commitments translated into action? Well, there are several examples that we detail in the report, but I'll highlight just a few today. So one important first step is that countries are integrating their commitments into their national plans and policies. So over the last 2 years, we've seen at least 77 countries either create national action plans to implement their commitments, they've integrated commitments into existing national plans or sector-wide policies, and they've created systems to monitor progress. We've also seen mobilization of regional support through the Maputo Plan of Action, which seeks to ensure universal access to sexual and reproductive health and rights across the African continent. Another manifestation of progress towards sexual and reproductive justice is the slew of reproductive rights legislation that we've seen in recent years. So the Marea Verde, or the Green Wave, in Latin America has continued to accelerate change, from the legalization of abortion in Argentina in 2020 to the decriminalization of abortion in Mexico the following year, and Colombia following suit just last year. These legislative advances follow global trends, as we've seen progress as well in Benin, Sierra Leone, South Korea, and other countries. So really, when the US Supreme Court stripped the constitutional right to an abortion last year, it made us quite an outlier, as we are just one of 4 countries to regress on abortion rights since 1994. We've seen also advancements towards sexual reproductive justice in the area of family planning. So many regions from Central and Southern Asia to Northern Africa to Latin America and the Caribbean have all made progress on reducing unmet need for family planning, though still have a far way to go to reach the goal of 0. To highlight one example, Pakistan conducted its first ever analysis of its family planning supply chain commodities in 2020 to identify bottlenecks and solutions. There have been strides towards increasing young people's access to comprehensive and age-responsive information and education as well. So over 130 countries participated in what was called the Transforming Education Summit last year, where they pledged educational improvements that will be critical to sexual and reproductive health outcomes. At the country level, Tanzania in 2021 ended a discriminatory policy that barred pregnant schoolgirls and adolescent mothers from continuing their education. Tanzania is also revolutionizing the way that they teach sexual and reproductive health education in and out of schools, as they've begun to use 3D animation of well-known female role models to address challenges that continue to restrict girls' choices and rights. From a financing perspective, several countries have taken steps to invest in sexual and reproductive health. In Morocco, for example, the government has pledged to offer a national public health insurance plan for all citizens. They also ensured free sexual and reproductive health services at primary health facilities. As of last year in France, women and girls up to age 25 can now access contraception free of charge, thanks to a recent bill passed by Parliament. In Scotland, addressing what many refer to as period poverty, the government passed legislation making free menstrual products available to anyone who needs them. And similarly, in Namibia, the government removed a 15% tax on period products. Despite these signs of progress, we continue to see persistent underfunding of sexual and reproductive health services. In many cases, services remain funded mostly out of pocket or through external donor funding, as we see in many low-income settings with the highest health burdens. So as Terry noted, significant funding gaps, particularly a lack of domestic public funding, continue to be one of the key challenges we're facing today. And beyond funding, we also need to consider the role of the private sector, who can and should be a partner in advancing sexual and reproductive justice, but better accountability mechanisms are needed to, for example, document the impact of environmental exposures created by industry on sexual and reproductive health outcomes. So this is all to say that while we are seeing advances, really important advances in sexual and reproductive justice in practice, we also need to continue that momentum. So specifically, we need to leverage the high number of Nairobi commitments that prioritize sexual and gender-based violence. This highlights that sexual and gender-based violence could be a powerful entry point to promoting broader sexual and reproductive justice approaches within and across regions. We should also continue to build alliances with parliamentarians and policymakers, increase transparency in funding, in the context of growing challenges that many of my fellow panelists have spoken about today, continuing to explore digital innovations and self-managed care when possible, and also investing in grassroots movements that demand sexual and reproductive justice. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much, Malia, for giving us those nuggets of good practice and what more can be done building on that. I know we're at time. We had hoped to have a bit of Q&A. I don't know whether I have. Okay, so I will, before we close, I will throw it open to any burning questions that you may have for the panelists. I know that we may have some online questions as well, but yes, please
Cunningham.
Go ahead.
There's a microphone.
Is there a microphone that you can?
Can you give him the microphone?
Yeah, but just one second, we'll get a microphone to you.
No, the online people won't be able to hear you, Nick. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
My name is Nicholas Cunningham. I'm a pediatrician and a public health former activist in this area. I would like to raise a question for you, but frame the question around the role of men in this movement. It seems to me that we have an example of very strong leadership, but they have one advantage over men. They're supported by women all over the world. When men get up to speak on this subject, they don't feel that kind of support from other men. Nonetheless, health professionals, from Alan Rosenfield, whom many of us knew at the School of Public Health, to David Morley in England, who really was a huge influence on what happened in Africa, Dr. Olukoye Ransom-Kuti, who was head of pediatrics at the Lagos University Hospital when I was there, was a powerful, powerful supporter of women's rights, women's involvement in healthcare, and feminism. And of course, his mother was the founder of women's liberation in Nigeria. So he came by it honestly. And of course, there are others. These people come either from, very often, from pediatrics or public health, or from OBGYN, like Professor Friday Okonofua, who is, I believe, listening in, I hope. These men need the support of you, and we need more men. Look at this audience. It's almost all women. This is not right. Men can support this movement without taking it over. They have to be the right men, and they have to have the leadership of strong women like you. But it can be done. And so my question is, what can you, in these representing these major organizations, do to get more men involved, especially from the health professions? Because they could do a lot to make this movement go stronger, faster, as we need to go faster and more broadly. The leadership is coming from politicians, but health professionals could do a great deal.
Absolutely.
So that's my question. Thank you very much.
That's a really important question. I'm going to throw it over to Dr. Kinem.
Sure. Thank you very much, Professor Nick Cunningham, and you raise a very important point, to my mind, from two standpoints. It's, for me, not a question of welcoming men into the room. There are no barriers to all people standing up for human rights, doing so every day, all the time. But I believe that the appeal to men has to be structured, as we did last week with the FGM Day, appeal to fathers, to so-called prospective husbands, to join with people who are demanding an end to female genital mutilation, which is theoretically a premarital surgery. That's very dangerous and damaging. More than that, though, I think, Nick, what UNFPA is trying to do with our youth strategy is to claim reproductive health. Gender, of course, applies to everyone. It is not a female-only trait. Appeal to young men in particular to educate themselves. A lot of the stalwarts of YPEER, of AFRIAN, of sports clubs that we relate to, are young men who are very clear that they would like to live in a gender-equal world, that they actually do not want to participate in systems that, in a sense, privilege them, but also curtail their own freedom and expectation of what opportunity should look like. So in our youth strategy, we talk about human relationships and very strongly make the case that the future of the world is actually in the hands of young people and that we need boys to avail themselves of sexuality education, to avail themselves of human rights approaches, and certainly whether physically, in the so-called real world or online, to interrupt violence when it occurs against anyone, but in particular young women who now have to depend on the web sometimes for societal interactions. So thanks so much for a great question.
Thank you. Do we have any more questions? Two online. Clarissa, would you mind?
We have a question for Dr. Kanem about, did the Commission find any allies in other sectors who are similarly interested in breaking down silos? And then we have a question about how stigma persists, especially within the healthcare space, and is exacerbated by inequality and access issues. Financial reengineering is a key, as is a shift from a biomedical approach to a social justice approach. How do we do this?
Well, I think Terry can take the second one. I'm happy
You can take
to
part of that
just
question.
briefly say that this commission has been so enlightening for us at UNFPA, and we are deployed wherever the need is greatest in 120 countries around the world. And I feel that the co-chairs, along with the staff that support this effort, have really allowed commissioners to debate. And they come from different walks of life all over the world. The young people on the commission have been quite vocal and are not there in a token realm. So I think their process has been very sophisticated. And indeed, I'm gratified that private sector actors have been really prominent. What happens in a workplace actually sets the tone for some of the gender equality that we're talking about. Is the woman's right to breastfeed on the job going to be upheld? Are we going to seek innovations in terms of how women's involvement in reproduction of society, like job reproduction, correlates with prosperity? Is their ability to function going to be respected in every sphere? And we've united with certain key actors in the private sector, including technology companies that are working on things like mobile health systems and the hotlines that we have to staff all over the place to improve the quality of support. Remembering that not everybody is online, that not everybody even has a phone, we've also turned to innovators to help with this process of thinking about reproductive health anew, up to and including new reproductive health drugs. And our academic partners, I think, have to be commended. Terry is a fantastic example. There are others who are, I think, following the advice that's coming out of the commission. The original report, No Exclusions, talked about counting people, as Terry mentioned in her remarks, who typically are just obliterated when we look at data we don't see. And I think there as well, it convinced me to co-lead a Lancet commission looking to the future of health and trying to embed some of these principles along with Professor Chris Murray at the IHME, the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation in Seattle, because not just the pandemic, but so much else, and Terry elucidated it, shows us that if you don't put women at the center, if you don't put young people at the center, if you don't think about who's not there, who got left behind during COVID? I mean, who died in droves because of vaccine inequities and things like this? We really have to look at a spectrum, and I think, Malia, your remarks also brought out, this is a multi-dimensional fight. The days when we really thought that, just providing nutrition to the mom, which doesn't necessarily happen either, but that was enough for mother and baby, are long over. And I think the structural issues have to be attended to, and that's what we want to see.
Just quickly on stigma and discrimination, I mean, so I mentioned in my remarks, often humanitarian actors are applying laws that don't comport with international standards, and they shouldn't be. I think we have to take very seriously, everyone involved in the humanitarian endeavor has to take very seriously eradicating bias and discrimination, whether that's around abortion, teenagers accessing contraception, and I don't think they have adequately. So I think it has to be a reset where no discrimination, it's not acceptable, and everybody has to own it. It's not just those of us who work on sexual and reproductive justice.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, thank you, everyone. Apologies for running over time, but I hope that was good that we did. I wanted to thank our wonderful panelists for their time and great presentations, and thank you all for joining us in what has been such a rich and thought-provoking discussion, and hopefully, more to come, and we will be moving towards that radical transformation that we all want to see. We encourage you to read the full report, which is available online. For those of you here in person, there are bookmarks circulating with the QR code, and for those of you online, we've provided a link to the report in the chat. So without further ado, please join me in thanking our panelists once again.